I'm a social scientist, and worse than that, I'm a political scientist, and I'm not sure how many political scientists there are here. Any others? No, I don't know if you're going to be able to do an analysis of betweenness of role of political scientists, at least not on this audience, but anyway, let's have a go. So I also at the moment hold an ESRC professorial fellowship, which is just coming to an end, but has given me, the title of that is the Internet, Political Science and Public Policy, and has given me the chance to really think about some of the challenges that the internet, social media, and the kind of data that we're all talking about pose to political science, both theoretically and methodologically. So I'm also director of something called the Oxford Internet Institute. We are a multidisciplinary department of the University of Oxford. We're a relatively new department. We're in the social sciences division. Our mission is to understand life online, broadly speaking, and to develop the social science of the internet. So we're in the social sciences division, but we are very multidisciplinary. So I'm a political scientist, we have other political scientists, we have economists, sociologists, we have a professor of law, a professor of philosophy, we have a team of geographers, but we also have a physicist, Taha Yasseri, who's going to be speaking later. We have computer scientists, as you might expect, we have informatics people. So we span, and we have a psychologist, we span all the divisions of the university. We crawl all over the internet and social media, so obviously we have a lot of reasons to develop the kind of methodologies and the sources of data of computational social science and data science, the kind of things we're talking about here. So I could show you lots of beautiful pictures of learning networks in MOOCs or virtual currencies or search engine markets or maps of the kind of cyber geography of the internet. If anybody's interested in that, do have a look at the Oxford Internet Institute's kind of digital presence, Google Information Geographies, and you'll see a whole collection of maps of the internet developed by our geographer Mark Graham and his research team. But I'm not going to do that. I'm actually going to focus in on something really, really quite narrow, which is petition signing. And I'll explain why in a minute. Many governments, not least the UK, the US, Canada, Germany, many countries have introduced or are introducing electronic petition platforms, and these have become extremely popular. So the number 10 did under the Blair administration. There's a new site, a government petitions platform now in the UK. We the People is the US platform. And petition signing is popular, and it's also popular on social media. As any of you go about your daily lives on social media, then you will be presented with petitions that you might want to sign. And you may sign them and you may share them. So they are spreading throughout social media networks. Why is that interesting? Well, petitions play an interesting role in democratic systems, and particularly in the era of social media and big data. Petition signing has actually long been the most popular form of political participation outside voting. And with the easy availability of electronic petition platforms, it's become even more popular. It's an example of what we call micro-donations of time and effort facilitated by social media. That is, social media reduce the transaction costs of an act of political participation relative to the participation costs. A nice example is if you're walking along a canal, for example, you may easily come across a poster which suggests that you donate £3 to the Canal Preservation Trust. Something that I think it's extremely unlikely in a pre-digital era that you would have necessarily thought about doing. You certainly wouldn't have wanted to write a cheque for £3 and send it off and find out what the Canal Preservation Trust is. But here, you're in the right setting, you're walking along by the side of the canal, you've got your phone, you've suddenly remembered how much you like canals and that you want them to carry on existing. And there's all sorts of examples of that on social media. sharing something, downloading something, uploading something, tweeting, retweeting, and signing, indeed, an electronic petition. All these are kind of micro donations of time and effort, which may seem insignificant on their own. And actually, in the UK political culture, they suffer an image problem in that in this country, something isn't politics unless it's very painful. It has to be painful. You have to suffer. You must go to a very boring meeting or in some way expend, as Oscar Wilde put it, the trouble with socialism is it cuts so dreadfully into the evenings. So these kind of micro acts don't go well with UK political culture, but we believe that they're very important because they scale up to large-scale mobilization, and we've been seeing so many examples of that, which I'm sure you're all familiar. They expand the ladder of participation in political science terms. And these large-scale mobilizations, they're kind of different because they're made up of these tiny micro-donations of effort. We don't know so much about them in political science terms as or political scientists don't, in comparison with movements of the past. So we're very interested in understanding those, in understanding the contribution they make to sort of the instability, the unpredictability of political systems, because they are the new democratic weather, if you like, that any political institutions or policymakers have to cope with, and they're very interesting. And they form an important part of the model of chaotic pluralism, which Taha, I, and our co-authors Peter John and Scott Hale have developed. So what is the data? And I confess this illustrates another kind of characteristic of big data that's rather frowned upon in social science terms, which is actually when I started suggesting that we collect this data, when we started collecting this data, I didn't know why, but I knew that it would be good. And it was. But that's not the conventional way that you're supposed to do things, particularly in social science. You must have a theory, a research question, and a hypothesis, and everything. I had the luxury to start producing this data in an exploratory way. And I think it illustrates the advantage like that. So this is data scraped from the UK Petitions platform. We now also scrape it from the US one. We scrape it every hour. We started scraping it every day, but that didn't give us fine-grained enough data. We've got around 50,000 petitions represented in that data and over 12 million signatures, which represents the popularity of this kind of activity in a country with a population of 65 million. And we also have data from the US site, as I said. Now, I know this is kind of, this kind of data is stale buns to a lot of you because it's not really, and it's not really that big. But I can tell you, in political science terms, this data is extraordinary. We've just not had data like that before outside voting data. So it is very interesting to think and experiment with what we can do with it. Ooh, that's another badger. Okay, so what's the first thing this data has shown us? Well, one of the things it's shown us is that most petitions completely fail to go anywhere. Around half the petitions actually only have one signature. 95% fail to get even 500 signatures, 99% fail to get 10,000, 99.9% fail to get the 100,000 signatures that you need for a parliamentary debate in the UK. And that finding is very robust across countries. So that's the first thing. I'd like to lead on from the previous presentation by having another picture of a badger. And in fact, when you look at any sort of participation in models in this country, go for a cute animal, really, or at least an animal that can make itself look cute. That's where it'll be. We were interested, obviously one interesting question is the importance of the issue of a petition. Petitions are very varied in the sort of issues they are campaigning for. This graph just shows that there's 3 petitions there, one which was fantastically successful and got a parliamentary debate, one which was somewhere in the middle, and one which completely bombed out with a handful of signatures, all almost exactly the same, calling for the end of the badger cull. Which is part of the policy of the current administration. So issue isn't enough to really, in any sense, predict how well you're going to do. As I said, the US petitions show a very similar pattern. That big white space there is just because in the US there is a threshold. You have to get 100 signatures before you can actually go public on the site. So they have this threshold, and also there's a deadline. And a much, in the UK, the deadline is a year, so petitions can sit around for a year before they go anywhere. Okay, thank you. It's working too quickly. Okay, so we've modelled this data looking for some kind of factor. This model was developed by Taha, building on the novelty factor developed by Wu and Huberman in their article of 2007. Show that basically the outreach potential of the outreach of a petition decays very quickly indeed. And indeed, if a petition hasn't reached some sort of critical mass in the first 10 hours, it's probably going to be digital dust. Again, that's a very robust finding. We see exactly the same attention decay in the US, although there are one or two differences in the US data in that they have to get 100 signatures to even be allowed on the site. They don't get exactly 100. They have some kind of momentum. They overshoot the 100 signatures, so they tend to get more. So that means that any successful petitions grow very quickly indeed. This graph just shows those petitions receiving more than 10,000 signatures. It shows that, it sort of begins to suggest, if you were going to change the petitions platform, things that you might want to think about, particularly the question of a deadline. You can see there that if you were to go for 100 days, for example, you would not lose. You would lose those few outliers, but you wouldn't lose very many of the successful petitions, as well as getting rid of a huge number of completely non-viable petitions. And there you can see the difference that I mentioned in the US, where the US data is more curved, looking that US petitions have, in general, a more substantive level of support in that kind of middle range. We're collecting the tweets of all the petitions, and we've started to look at that data. So this is only the start of looking at that data, but it does suggest an association between the signatures and the tweets, as you might expect. And we want to develop a model for that data as well. Another interesting thing about this sort of data is that if platforms change, obviously, you can see the effect in the data. So there's all sorts of natural experiments out there in this kind of data. And we're very interested in how those natural experiments could be used by policymakers to feed back into the design of platforms. And really, one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this data in particular is because I think it's a nice proof of concept of that idea. Now, we started collecting this data completely without telling anyone. We didn't ask the people who run the petitions platform whether we could do it because, well, they might have said no, and that would have been a shame. And actually, I am on the advisory board of the the government digital service who do produce this platform and run this platform. And yeah, it would just not have been nice if they would say no. I mean, it's perfectly publicly available data. We don't keep the names or anything. We don't have names of people or anything like that other than the petition creator, which has to be public for the petition to get created. So I don't see that as a huge issue, but it is the case. We did eventually go and see them and tell them that we were collecting this data to see if they would be interested in it, and of course they, after initial surprise, they were indeed interested in it, and then they shared with us in a sort of reciprocal way the Google Analytics data for the platform. So that was it's a nice example of data sharing between academic researchers and policymakers. So so one example of a natural experiment, and of course there will be a great many as the platform is maintained over time, we would hope. But anyway, this was an example of the people who run the platform introducing trending data. So they introduced the 6 most popular petitions on the as a sort of box on a corner of the petitions platform, and that meant that anybody going to that particular page would see the most popular Petitions. If they go there via a link on Twitter or something like that, and they're directed straight to a petition, then they won't see that trending data. But if any sense, they go on the home page. And that was introduced without, I think the Government Digital Service very much thought that that wouldn't make any difference at all, but we wanted to see if that was right, if it did make any difference. In fact, yes, well, it didn't make any difference into the total number of signatures. If you see the dotted line there, represents before and after the trending part was introduced, then it is exactly the same before and afterwards, so the total number of signatures was the same. But what we did find is that the trending affected the concentration of signatures. So, as I'm sure most of you would expect, the rich got richer. In that sense, some of the poor got poorer. So there was more concentration around the trending petitions. They got more signatures. But it wasn't all of them. It wasn't done in a uniform way across the 1 to 6. As you might expect, the first petition became more popular, but also number 3, because they were on the left-hand side of the screen at the expense of number 2. Again, what you would expect from HCI research, but not exactly the effect that it was intended to have. We also found something which was confirmed by the Google Analytics data, that some users do come directly to the home page, and they are exposed to that trending information. I found this quite encouraging, that it seems that as well as coming directly to the home page, they also, after signing a petition, go to the home page and then are exposed to this influence of the trending information, suggesting that some people, and it's not a huge percentage of visitors, but it's interesting, sort of in political science terms, that they kind of go to do a little bit of politics, but they're not quite sure what, but they go and look to see if there's something they're interested in and something that they feel like signing. Another thing that Google Analytics has told us is that this is a huge, that Facebook is a huge driver of petitions, of referrals to the petitions site. Nearly half of all referrals come from Facebook, especially from Facebook Mobile. Twitter, also the red line there, playing a role greater than Google Search. Again, exhibiting the large role that social media play in these kinds of micro donations of participation. So, I mean, I think this kind of data is a nice example of big data. It does represent the whole population of petition signing. It has that kind of whole of population characteristic, which makes big data interesting. It is a new kind of data for social science, and particularly for political science, where we've been so short of real-time transactional data of this kind. It can be generated non-obtrusively, but the sharing with policymakers, I think I'm very pleased with that. I mean, in the US, there's a digital analytics program that the government are running, which will give all agencies not just access to their own Google Analytics for their own digital presence, but the Google Analytics for all the other parts of government. And I think that will be an incredibly rich resource for policymakers, and it's something that I would be keen on lobbying for UK policymakers to have. I should say that that program in the US, very, very interesting, run by one person in the General Services Administration. I mean, she's going on maternity leave in a few weeks' time, and I don't know what will happen then, although I can tell you that her last maternity leave lasted only a week, because she is running that whole program, which is improving hugely in demand. But I would say there was a case for putting more resources into programs like that, you know, and recognizing the value of that sort of data as hardcore administrative data in a digital world. This really is informing, this data is informing platform change. The site is going, the platform is going to be changed. It's a bit of an odd one, the Petitions platform, because the original version was run by number 10 Downing Street. The next version was run by the Government Digital Service in the Cabinet Office. But if you get over 100,000 signatures, you get a parliamentary debate. But that change to allow successful petitions to generate a parliamentary debate was introduced by the government without consulting with the House of Commons. So they mandated the House of Commons debate without actually talking to the House of Commons about it. This has caused some kind of tension between the executive and the legislature in the UK, and they are trying to resolve that by maybe having a joint petitions platform. So they're currently talking about that. We went to present this data to the leader of the House of Commons 3 weeks ago because they'd heard about the research we're doing. They're very interested. They're talking, and I'm going to speak to the procedure committee of the House of Commons in a couple of weeks' time. So again, it's a nice example where it's actual policymakers are actually using academic research. We also were last week in the White House talking to the architects of the We the People platform and comparing our data with theirs, again, with potential influence across both platforms. And we've been asked to give expert witness to the Canadian Parliament, who are thinking of setting up a petition platform along the lines of the UK and US models. So I think illustrating kind of in micro what sort of influences this kind of data and these kind of methods can have right across the board. Finally, what are we going to do with it next? Well, we have a new project funded by Google where we are looking at the complete ecology of petitioning in both the UK and the US. The data now is geocoded and timestamped, and that will allow us to produce a kind of map of petitioning of the country. It will be a kind of map of collective attention and participation, which I don't think, which I think will be very interesting to all sorts of people and policymakers. It will show which parts of the country care about what they're willing. It'll show that they're thinking about something, but also that they're willing to do something about it, even if it's a small thing. We're looking at the virality on social media. Some research by Duncan Watts and his team has suggested that petitions are one of the most viral of things on social media. And we're also interested to see other platforms. These are government platforms where they directly petition the government. We're interested to comparing behavior, social behavior on these platforms with other platforms like change.org, where they're not directly petitioning governments. And I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Thank you.